Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we're journeying north. We're leaving behind the sun-baked marble of the classical world and heading into the cold, mist-shrouded lands of the Norsemen. We often think of the Vikings as one-dimensional figures, savage raiders in longships with horned helmets and great, bushy beards. But behind the axe and the shield was a culture with a rich, complex, and profoundly dark mythology. Theirs was not a world of benevolent, perfect gods. It was a cosmos of fierce, flawed deities, scheming giants, and terrifying monsters, all locked in a struggle against a fate that was already written, a doom that even the gods could not escape. This is the story of those gods. So before we join the circle around the hearthfire, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see the global community we're building. Alright, find a comfortable spot. Let the sound of the wind howling outside serve as our music. The stald is about to begin. Imagine you are in the great longhouse of a Viking chieftain in the heart of Scandinavia around the 9th century. Outside, a brutal winter has buried the world in snow and ice. The wind screams like a hungry wolf. But in here is warm. A great crackling fire pit runs down the center of the hall, its smoke rising to a hole in the thatched roof, staining the great wooden beams black. The air is thick with the smells of roasting meat, spilled ale, wet wool, and the press of many unwashed bodies seeking shelter from the cold. You are sitting on a rough-hewn bench, a wooden cup of mead in your hand, surrounded by the warriors and families of the clan. The feast is over, the boasts have been made, and a hush falls over the hall. All eyes turn to an old man sitting on a carved chair near the fire. He is the skald, the storyteller, the keeper of memories. His face is a roadmap of wrinkles. His beard is long and white, but his eyes, reflecting the firelight, are sharp and full of ancient knowledge. He takes a long drink from his horn of ale, clears his throat, and his deep, raspy voice cuts through the silence. He does not begin with stories of great battles or famous kings. He begins, as all stories must, at the very beginning. A beginning before time, before gods, before men. In the dawn of all things, he says, his voice a low rumble. There was nothing, not sand, nor sea, nor the cool waves. Earth did not exist, nor the heavens above. There was only a great, yawning void, a silent, empty space of pure potential. This was Ginnungagap. The Skald story, passed down through generations, describes a universe born not from a single benevolent act of creation, but from a violent, chaotic collision of elemental opposites. To one side of this great emptiness lay a realm of primordial fire and eternal flame. This was Muspelheim. It was a world of searing heat, of molten rivers, of glowing lava, a place of blinding light and unbearable temperatures. It was guarded at its edge by a great fire giant named Surtur, who wielded a sword that burned brighter and hotter than the sun itself, waiting for the day he would use it to burn the world. To the other side of the void lay the opposite extreme, a realm of primordial ice and endless swirling mist. This was Niflheim, the world of darkness. From its heart sprung the great spring, Vergelmir, from which flowed 11 great poisonous rivers known as the Ellevager. These rivers flowed out of Niflheim and into the great emptiness of Ginnungagap, where the intense, biting cold caused their venomous waters to freeze solid. Over eons, great mountains of ice, frost, and rime built up, stretching out into the void, a silent, frozen landscape under a starless sky. This vision of a world born from a violent clash between two opposing forces, fire and ice, was central to the Viking mindset. It was not a gentle, ordered creation from a divine word. It was a chaotic and elemental one, reflecting a worldview that saw the universe as a place of constant struggle, a battle between extremes. This theme would echo through all of their myths, from the birth of the gods to their final, fiery doom at Ragnarok. For the Norsemen, life itself was a battle fought in the contested space between the burning heat of ambition and the cold, hard reality of fate. And so for an age, these two realms existed in a state of silent opposition, separated by the great empty chasm. The burning embers and hot winds from Muspelheim drifted out over the void, while the frozen, venomous ice from Niflheim crept ever closer from the other side. Then, inevitably, they met. Beskoud leans forward, his eyes gleaming. He tells you of the moment when the hot air from the south first touched the great glaciers of the north. It was not a gentle meeting. It was a hiss. A great cosmic steaming as fire met ice in the center of the Ginnungagap. The frozen venom of the rivers began to melt, to drip. And in those drops, stirred by the life-giving heat from the south, something began to form. It was not a god. It was not a beast. It was something vast, primal, and new. And in that great hissing abyss where fire first met ice, the lifeless void began to stir. A shape was taking shape in the thawing frost. The first being was about to be born. The old skald leans forward, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper that draws everyone around the fire closer. He tells you that in the hissing abyss of Ginnungagap, where the hot winds of Muspelheim met the frozen, venomous rivers of Niflheim, the ice began to melt and drip, and in those life-giving drops, a shape began to form. It was not a god. It was not a beast. It was something far older, far more primal. From the thawing frost, the first being emerged. His name was Ymir, and he was a giant. Not a giant of stone or mountain, but a colossal frost giant, the ancestor of all the Jotnar who would later plague the gods. He was immense, chaotic, and born of the poisonous ice, and he was the first living thing in the universe. As he slept in the warm air, the sweat from his body formed other beings. From under his left arm, a male and female frost giant were born, and from his legs, a monstrous six-headed giant came into being. This was the raw, untamed, and often grotesque nature of creation in the Norse world. As Ymir was forming, so too was another creature. From the same melting ice came Audhumla, the great cosmic cow. She was a gentle, nurturing being, and from her 4 great udders flowed 4 rivers of pure milk, which provided the sustenance for the giant Ymir. The universe in its infancy consisted of a hungry giant and a nourishing cow, adrift in a misty void. While Ymir fed on her milk, Audhumla found her own sustenance by licking the great, salty blocks of ice that littered the void. For 1 full day, she licked a single block of ice, and by evening, a man's hair had appeared. On the 2nd day, she licked again, and the man's full head was revealed. On the 3rd day of her patient work, the entire man was freed from the ice. His name was Buri, and he was the first of a new race, the ancestor of the gods. He was strong, beautiful, and completely alone. Buri, in time, had a son named Bor. Bor then took a wife from the other race, marrying a giantess named Bestla, the daughter of one of the giants born of Ymir. This mingling of the 2 primordial bloodlines, the chaotic giants and the noble ancestors of the gods, created a tension that would define the cosmos forever. And from this union, 3 sons were born: Odin, the eldest and wisest, and his 2 brothers, Vili and Ve. These 3 brothers were the first of the Aesir, the gods who would come to rule the world. But they had no world to rule. They existed in the gray, formless void of Ginnungagap, under the shadow of the great, chaotic giant Ymir and his ever-growing brood. Odin and his brothers saw that there could be no order, no light, no future, as long as this raw primal chaos held sway. And so they decided on a course of action that was both a terrible act of murder and a necessary act of creation. They went to war. The skald's voice grows deeper as he describes the battle. The three young gods, full of purpose and strength, rose up against the great Ymir. The battle was cataclysmic. It shook the foundations of the unformed universe. But in the end, the three brothers were victorious. They killed Ymir. His death was the true beginning of the world. For the Norsemen, creation was not a peaceful act. It was a violent, bloody sacrifice. Order had to be built from the corpse of chaos. And so, Odin, Vili, and Ve became the first architects, and the body of the slain giant was their raw material. They dragged Ymir's immense corpse to the very center of Ginnungagap. From his blood, they formed all the oceans, the rivers, and the lakes of the world. So much blood flowed from his wounds that it created a great flood that drowned all the other frost giants, save for one, Bergilmir and his wife, who escaped on a wooden ark. From them, a new race of giants would descend, forever holding a grudge against the gods for the death of their ancestor. From Ymir's flesh, the brothers fashioned the earth. They pounded it and shaped it, creating the flat, circular land of the world. From his unbroken bones, they raised the mountains and the high cliffs. His teeth and the shattered fragments of his bones they scattered across the land, and these became the rocks and pebbles. Then they took Ymir's colossal skull and with great effort raised it up to form the dome of the sky. To hold it in place, they posted 4 powerful dwarves at each of the cardinal points. Their names were Northri, Sudri, Austri, and Westri, north, south, east, and west. Ynir's brain they tossed into the air, and it became the dark, swirling clouds. To light their new world, they caught the burning embers and sparks that flew from the fiery realm of Muspelheim. They placed these sparks in the great dark dome of the sky to create the sun, the moon, and all the stars. They set them on their appointed courses, creating the cycle of day and night and the passing of the seasons. The world was now built, a great circular landmass floating in a vast sea made of a giant's blood, surrounded by the realm of the new giants, Jotunheim. This new, fertile land in the center, they named Midgard, the Middle Earth. It was a world of mountains and rocks, of seas and clouds, lit by a new sun and moon. But it was an empty world, silent and awaiting life. The gods had created a stage, but there were not yet any actors to play their parts upon it. And there were still other realms to be accounted for, all held together by a force they could not yet see. The old skald pauses his tale, letting the fire crackle and spit in the sudden silence of the longhouse. He takes a slow drink of his ale, and you can see the firelight reflected in his ancient eyes. He has told you how the world of men was made, but now he must explain its place in the grand scheme of things. Midgard, he explains, was not alone. It was but one of 9 worlds, all nested within the branches and roots of a single, colossal, and sacred entity. The great world tree, Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil was not simply a tree. It was the very axis of the universe, the pillar that held the entire cosmos together. It was an immense and eternal ash tree, so vast that its branches stretched out over all the 9 worlds and reached high into the heavens, its leaves brushing against the stars. Its great trunk was the center of all things, and its 3 enormous roots delved deep into the different realms, drawing sustenance from sacred wells. This was not a perfect, serene creation. Yggdrasil was in a constant state of struggle, a living embodiment of the precarious balance of the Norse universe. At its very top, in the highest branches, sat a great, wise eagle, whose name is not remembered, who could see all that happened in the 9 worlds. And sitting between the eagle's eyes was a small hawk named Vedvolnir. At the bottom of the tree, deep in the misty realm of Niflheim, one of its roots was eternally gnawed upon by a monstrous dragon, a great serpent named Nidhogger, Malice Striker, and running up and down the trunk of the great tree, acting as a cosmic messenger of insults, was a squirrel named Ratatosker. He would scurry from the root to the crown, carrying the taunts of the dragon Nidhogger up to the eagle, and carrying the eagle's scornful replies back down, forever stirring up trouble between the top and the bottom of the world. The tree's own life was also under constant assault from 4 great stags that roamed its branches, nibbling at its leaves and bark. Yggdrasil, like the world it supported, endured, but it was a life of constant struggle. These 9 worlds were arranged in 3 levels. At the top, in the highest branches, were the realms of the gods and the elves. The highest and most glorious was Asgard, the home of the Aesir gods, the tribe of Odin. It was a mighty fortress in the sky, surrounded by a great wall, a world of magnificent golden-roofed halls. From Asgard, a shimmering rainbow bridge called the Bifrost stretched down to the world of men, a path only the gods could travel, guarded day and night by the ever-vigilant god Heimdall. Also at this level were Vanaheim, the home of the other tribe of gods, the Vanir, associated with fertility and nature, and Alfheim, the beautiful, radiant world of the light elves. In the middle level, anchored to the trunk of Yggdrasil, was the world you know, Midgard, the Middle Earth, the realm of humanity. After creating it from Ymir's flesh, the gods built a great defensive wall around it using the giant's eyebrows to protect it from the chaos of the outer worlds. Also at this level was Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, a vast, wild land of rocks, snow, and eternal winter. And there was Svartalfheim, the dark, underground kingdom of the dwarves, the master smiths who forge the greatest treasures of the gods in their subterranean forges. At the bottom, deep within the roots of Yggdrasil, lay the primordial and underworld realms. Here was Niflheim, the world of mist and ice from which all things began, now a place of darkness where the root-gnawing dragon Nidhogger dwelled. Here too was Muspelheim, the world of fire, still burning, its entrance guarded by the giant Surtur. And finally, there was Hell, the grim realm of the dishonorable dead. This was not a place of fire and damnation like a Christian hell. It was a cold, gloomy, and shadowy world where those who died of sickness or old age, rather than in battle, would spend eternity. This complex cosmology of 9 realms, all interconnected by a great cosmic tree, is unique among world mythologies. It created a universe that was not simply a flat earth with a heaven above and a hell below. Instead, it was a multi-layered, dynamic world where gods, humans, giants, and monsters could, and often did, travel between realms. The Bifrost Bridge, the roots of Yggdrasil, these were the pathways for the great myths and adventures that were about to unfold. It was a universe ripe with the possibility of conflict and discovery. The Skald tells you that after the gods had arranged the worlds and set the sun and moon on their course, Odin and his brothers, Vili and Ve, were walking along the seashore of the new, empty world of Midgard. The land was beautiful, a world of mountains and plains, forests and rivers, but it was silent. It was a stage without actors. On the beach, they found two pieces of driftwood that had washed ashore. One was from an ash tree, the other from an elm. Odin, the Allfather, picked them up. He breathed into them and gave them spirit and life. Vili gave them consciousness and movement. And Ve gave them the senses, sight, hearing, and speech. The logs of wood were transformed. They became the first man, named Ask, from the ash tree, and the first woman, named Embla, from the elm. They were the parents of all humanity, and the gods gave them the realm of Midgard to live in, to build, to fill with their children, their laughter, their struggles, and their stories. The world was now complete, ready for the great saga to truly begin. The old skald's voice changes. The dark, conspiratorial tone he used for Odin is gone, replaced by a loud, booming heartiness that seems to shake the very rafters of the longhouse. He is speaking now of the god beloved by the common man, the god you would call upon not in a quiet ritual of magic, but in the heart of a raging storm. He speaks of Thor. If Odin was the god of kings, poets, and secrets, his son was the god of the farmer, the sailor, and the warrior. He was Thor, the thunderer, and his business was not with riddles and complex prophecies, but with the simple, satisfying, and bone-shattering crash of a hammer against a giant's skull. He was immense in his strength, with a great, wild beard as red as fire, and an appetite for food and ale that was legendary even among the gods. He was a god of action, not of thought, quick to anger, but also quick to laugh. He was direct, honest, and while perhaps not the cleverest of the gods, his loyalty to Asgard and his protection of Midgard were absolute. While Odin was a distant, often intimidating figure, concerned with the cosmic fate of the universe and his own foretold doom at Ragnarok, Thor's focus was much more immediate. His eternal duty was the defense of the mortal world. He rode across the heavens in a great chariot, pulled not by magnificent horses, but by two powerful goats named Tangrisnir and Tenjoster, Teeth-bearer and Teeth-grinder. The rumbling of his chariot wheels was what mortals heard as thunder. He was constantly waging a one-man war against the frost giants of Jotunheim, the forces of chaos that always threatened to encroach upon the world of men. To the average Viking farmer or fisherman, a prayer to Thor was a prayer for protection against the destructive forces of nature, a plea for strength in the face of a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. This immense popularity is confirmed in the archaeological record. While depictions and mentions of Odin in historical findings are relatively rare, thousands of small, hammer-shaped amulets representing Thor's weapon have been found all across the Viking world, from Iceland to Russia. These pendants, collectively known as Mjolnir amulets, were worn by ordinary people, men, women, and children, as a simple, powerful ward against evil and misfortune. To wear the hammer of Thor was to invoke the power of the strongest god, to ask for his personal protection. In a dangerous and unpredictable world, Thor was a comforting and reliable presence. Of course, Thor would be nothing without his three great treasures, the instruments of his power. The first and most famous was his hammer, Mjolnir. Forged by the master dwarven smiths, Brokkr and Atri, it was the most powerful weapon in the 9 realms. It was indestructible, and when thrown, it would never miss its target and would always return to its master's hand. Its only flaw was that its handle was slightly too short, a result of Loki's meddling during its creation. To wield its immense power, Thor required his other 2 treasures, a belt of strength known as Meginggjord, which was said to double his already godlike might, and a pair of iron gauntlets, Jarngrapr, without which he could not handle the mighty hammer. The stories told of Thor were not tales of complex magic or political intrigue. They were straightforward sagas of strength, courage, and sometimes of the god being tricked by those cleverer than him. One of the most famous tales tells of his journey to the castle of a giant king named Utgarda Loki. The giant, knowing he could not defeat Thor in a contest of pure strength, challenged him to a series of seemingly simple tests, which were in fact elaborate illusions. First, he challenged Thor to a drinking contest, presenting him with a great horn filled with mead. Thor drank 3 massive gulps, but the level of the liquid barely seemed to lower. He had failed. Then, he challenged Thor to lift a large gray cat from the floor. Thor strained with all his might, but could only manage to lift one of its paws from the ground. Again, he had failed. Finally, the giant challenged him to wrestle an old, frail-looking woman. Thor wrestled with all his power, but the old woman was impossibly strong, and she forced him down to one knee. He had been humiliated and defeated. As Thor was leaving the castle, shamed by his failure, Utgard Loki confessed the truth. The drinking horn was magically connected to the sea itself. Thor had drunk so much that he had actually lowered the ocean levels, creating the tides. The great cat was not a cat at all. It was Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, which encircles the entire world. The fact that Thor had managed to lift even one of its paws from the ground had terrified the giants. And the old woman he had wrestled was not a woman. She was the embodiment of old age itself, a force that no one, not even the gods, can ever defeat. The fact that Thor had only been forced to one knee had filled the giants with a terror beyond measure. This story perfectly captures the essence of Thor. He was a god of uncomplicated, almost limitless physical power. He was not a thinker. He was a fighter. He was the protector of the common man, the strong arm that kept the forces of chaos at bay, the thunder in the sky that was both a terrifying display of power and a comforting promise that the guardian of Midgard was watching over them. The old Skald's voice changes. The dark conspiratorial tone he used for Odin is gone, replaced by a loud, booming heartiness that seems to shake the very rafters of the longhouse. He is speaking now of the god beloved by the common man, the god you would call upon not in a quiet ritual of magic, but in the heart of a raging storm. He speaks of Thor. If Odin was the god of kings, poets, and secrets, his son was the god of the farmer, the sailor, and the warrior. He was Thor, the thunderer, and his business was not with riddles and complex prophecies, but with the simple, satisfying, and bone-shattering crash of a hammer against a giant's skull. He was immense in his strength, with a great wild beard as red as fire, and an appetite for food and ale that was legendary even among the gods. He was a god of action, not of thought. Quick to anger, but also quick to laugh. He was direct, honest, and while perhaps not the cleverest of the gods, his loyalty to Asgard and his protection of Midgard were absolute. While Odin was a distant, often intimidating figure, concerned with the cosmic fate of the universe and his own foretold doom at Ragnarok, Thor's focus was much more immediate. His eternal duty was the defense of the mortal world. He rode across the heavens in a great chariot, pulled not by magnificent horses, but by 2 powerful goats named Tangrisnir and Tangnjoster, Teeth-bearer and Teeth-grinder. The rumbling of his chariot wheels was what mortals heard as thunder. He was constantly waging a one-man war against the frost giants of Jotunheim, the forces of chaos that always threatened to encroach upon the world of men. To the average Viking farmer or fisherman, a prayer to Thor was a prayer for protection against the destructive forces of nature, a plea for strength in the face of a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. This immense popularity is confirmed in the archaeological record. While depictions and mentions of Odin in historical findings are relatively rare, thousands of small, hammer-shaped amulets representing Thor's weapon have been found all across the Viking world, from Iceland to Russia. These pendants, collectively known as Mjolnir amulets, were worn by ordinary people, men, women, and children, as a simple, powerful ward against evil and misfortune. To wear the hammer of Thor was to invoke the power of the strongest god, to ask for his personal protection. In a dangerous and unpredictable world, Thor was a comforting and reliable presence. Of course, Thor would be nothing without his three great treasures, the instruments of his power. The first and most famous was his hammer, Mjolnir. Forged by the master dwarven smiths, Brokkr and Eitri, it was the most powerful weapon in the 9 realms. It was indestructible, and when thrown, it would never miss its target and would always return to its master's hand. Its only flaw was that its handle was slightly too short, a result of Loki's meddling during its creation. To wield its immense power, Thor required his other 2 treasures, a belt of strength known as Megingirth, which was said to double his already godlike might, and a pair of iron gauntlets, Jarngreikr, without which he could not handle the mighty hammer. The stories told of Thor were not tales of complex magic or political intrigue. They were straightforward sagas of strength, courage, and sometimes of the god being tricked by those cleverer than him. One of the most famous tales tells of his journey to the castle of a giant king named Utgardaloki. The giant, knowing he could not defeat Thor in a contest of pure strength, challenged him to a series of seemingly simple tests, which were in fact elaborate illusions. First, he challenged Thor to a drinking contest, presenting him with a great horn filled with mead. Thor drank 3 massive gulps, but the level of the liquid barely seemed to lower. He had failed. Then, he challenged Thor to lift a large gray cat from the floor. Thor strained with all his might, but could only manage to lift one of its paws from the ground. Again, he had failed. Finally, the giant challenged him to wrestle an old, frail-looking woman. Thor wrestled with all his power, but the old woman was impossibly strong, and she forced him down to one knee. He had been humiliated and defeated. As Thor was leaving the castle, shamed by his failure, Utgardaloki confessed the truth. The drinking horn was magically connected to the sea itself. Thor had drunk so much that he had actually lowered the ocean levels, creating the tides. The great cat was not a cat at all. It was Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, which encircles the entire world. The fact that Thor had managed to lift even one of its paws from the ground had terrified the giants. And the old woman he had wrestled was not a woman. She was the embodiment of old age itself, a force that no one, not even the gods, can ever defeat. The fact that Thor had only been forced to one knee had filled the giants with a terror beyond measure. This story perfectly captures the essence of Thor. He was a god of uncomplicated, almost limitless physical power. He was not a thinker, he was a fighter. He was the protector of the common man, the strong arm that kept the forces of chaos at bay, the thunder in the sky that was both a terrifying display of power and a comforting promise that the guardian of Midgard was watching over them. The fire in the longhouse crackles, sending a shower of sparks up towards the smoky rafters. The skald's voice, which boomed with the thunder of Thor, now becomes quieter, more nuanced. But to think of Asgard as only a realm of warrior kings and thunder gods, he says, is to see only the sword and the shield, and to ignore the hand that weaves the threads of destiny. The world of the Aesir and Vanir was balanced by the power of the goddesses, whose influence was woven into the very fabric of life, love, and fate. At the head of the goddesses sat Frigg, the wife of Odin and the queen of Asgard. She was not merely a consort. She was a figure of immense power and quiet dignity. Her domain was that of marriage, motherhood, the family, and the household, the very heart of Norse society. But her greatest power was one she shared with her husband, the gift of prophecy. Frigg, it was said, knew the destinies of all beings, but unlike Odin, who frantically sought to change his fate, she rarely spoke of what she knew. She carried the heavy burden of her foresight with a profound, sorrowful silence. She knew of the coming of Ragnarok. She knew of the impending death of her beloved son, Balder. This knowledge gave her an air of tragic wisdom. A queen who ruled over a golden age she knew was doomed. The most famous story about her is not one of battle, but of desperate love. In an attempt to protect her son, she traveled the 9 realms and made every single thing, from fire and water to stones, trees, and diseases, swear an oath that they would never harm Balder. It was a testament to her power and influence that they all agreed. While Frigg represented the queen and the matriarch, the other great goddess of the pantheon represented a wilder, more primal form of female power. She was Freya, and she was not of the Aesir, but of the Vanir, a separate tribe of gods associated with nature, fertility, and magic, who came to live in Asgard after a great war between the 2 clans. This made her a perpetual, powerful outsider. Freya was the goddess of love, beauty, sexuality, and desire. She wore a magnificent necklace, Brisingamen, forged by the dwarves, which was said to make her irresistible. She wept tears of pure gold and rode in a chariot pulled not by goats, but by 2 great cats. But to see her as only a goddess of love would be a dangerous mistake. She was also a fierce goddess of war. It was Freya, not Odin, who presided over the field of Folkvanger, and she had the right to choose her half of all warriors slain in battle. Odin and his Valkyries would take the other half to Valhalla. This placed her on equal footing with the All-Father, as a ruler of the glorious dead, a deity a warrior would be proud to serve in the afterlife. Her greatest power, however, was her mastery of a specific and potent form of magic known as satyr. This was a shamanic practice that involved entering a trance state to see the future and, more importantly, to shape it, to weave the threads of fate to suit one's purpose. Satyr was considered a female art, and Freya was its greatest practitioner. The magic was so powerful that even Odin, in his endless quest for knowledge, coveted it. He humbled himself to learn the art from her, an act for which the trickster Loki would later mock him, as it was considered unmanly for a male god to engage in such magic. The prominence of figures like Frigg and Freya reveals a complex view of female power in the Norse world. While the society of the Vikings was patriarchal, their mythology was filled with powerful female figures, goddesses, seeresses known as Volur, and legendary shield maidens, who wielded immense influence. Freya, in particular, as the master of satyr, represents a form of spiritual and magical power that was seen as distinctly female, and was both deeply respected and deeply feared. Other goddesses played their vital roles as well. There was Idun, the keeper of the golden apples of immortality. It was only by eating her fruit that the gods were able to stave off old age and maintain their power. Her abduction by a giant, an event orchestrated by Loki, was one of the greatest crises the gods ever faced, as they immediately began to wither and grow old without her life-giving apples. There was also Skadi, a giantess, who married the Vanir god Njord. She was a goddess of the wilderness, of skiing, of the hunt, and of the harsh, beautiful mountains of the north, representing the untamed power of nature itself. And so, the great gods and goddesses of Asgard ruled in a delicate, often tense, balance. Odin's grim wisdom, Thor's honest strength, Frigg's silent foresight, and Freya's wild, untamable magic. They were a family, but a complicated and often dysfunctional one. But there was one being who walked the golden halls of Asgard, who belonged to no family but his own, who served no ideal but his own whim, and whose silver tongue and clever mind would prove to be more dangerous than any giant's club. He was the trickster, the shapeshifter. He was the enigma of Loki. The firelight dances, and you see the old skald smile, a flicker of dark amusement in his eyes. He has told you of the noble, the wise, and the strong. But now he speaks of the clever. There was one who walked the halls of Asgard, who was not of the Aesir by blood. He says, his voice a low, intimate whisper. He was not their sworn enemy, the giant, nor was he of the Vanir. He was both, and he was neither. He was the god of the liminal space, the boundary crosser, the question that had no answer. He was Loki. Loki's origins were in the chaotic world of the giants. His father was the Jotun Farbauti. Yet, he lived in Asgard. This was because, in the early days of the world, he had sworn a sacred oath with the All-Father himself, mingling their blood and becoming blood brothers. This oath granted Loki a place among the Aesir, a seat at their table, and Odin's protection. It was a promise Odin would uphold, often to his great regret. Loki was defined not by strength or honor, but by his breathtaking, nucurial intelligence. He was handsome, charismatic, and his mind was a labyrinth of schemes. He was a master of words, able to talk his way into and out of any situation with a silver tongue. He was also a master shapeshifter, capable of changing his form into any creature he desired, from a salmon to a fly to a beautiful white mare. But at his core, he was driven by a love of mischief, a restless and often malicious impulse to stir up trouble simply to see what would happen. He was the personification of chaos, living in the very heart of the gods' ordered world. For a long time, however, Loki was a kind of necessary chaos. His schemes often created terrible problems for the gods, but his cleverness was so great that he was usually the only one who could solve them, often leaving the gods better off than they were before. One of the earliest tales tells of the building of Asgard's Great Wall. A mysterious giant came to the gods and offered to build an impenetrable wall around their realm in just 3 seasons. The price, however, was impossibly high. He demanded the sun, the moon, and the hand of the goddess Freya in marriage. While the other gods scoffed, Loki, with a sly grin, persuaded them to accept the deal, but only if the giant could complete the work alone. With no help but his magical stallion, Svadilfari, the gods agreed, thinking the task impossible. But the stallion was so powerful that the giant was on the verge of finishing the wall on time. The gods, in a panic, turned on Loki, blaming him for the disastrous bargain. To fix the mess he had created, Loki shapeshifted into a beautiful mare and lured the stallion away from his work. Without his horse, the giant could not finish the wall in time, and the gods were saved from their terrible pact. In a bizarre and telling footnote to the story, Loki, still in the form of a mare, later gave birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, who would become Odin's own magnificent steed. On another occasion, purely for the sake of malicious mischief, Loki crept into the chambers of Thor's wife, Sif, and cut off her magnificent, famous golden hair. The rage of Thor was so immense that he was about to crush every bone in Loki's body. To save his own life, Loki was forced to go to the dwarves of Svartalfheim, the master smiths. He cleverly tricked them into a competition, and in their efforts to outdo one another, the dwarves not only forged a new head of magical, flowing golden hair for Sif, but also created the greatest treasures of the gods, Odin's spear Gumnir, the golden boar Gullinbursti, and most importantly of all, Thor's mighty hammer Mjolnir. Loki's petty, spiteful act had, through his own frantic scheming, inadvertently provided the gods with the very weapons they would need to defend their world. Loki fits perfectly into the mythological archetype of the trickster, a figure found in cultures all over the world. The trickster is a being of chaos who challenges the established order, breaks taboos, and through their pranks and schemes, often brings about necessary change or reveals hidden truths. For the Vikings, Loki represented the unpredictable element in a world they believed was otherwise governed by an unchangeable fate. He was the force of cleverness and chaos that could both save the gods and ultimately be the architect of their doom. For a long time, he was a welcome, if dangerous, presence in Asgard. But the mischief in his heart was slowly souring into true malice. His pranks became crueler, his schemes more self-serving. His jealousy of the other gods, particularly of their goodness and their honor, began to fester within him. He was the outsider, the half-giant, and he would never truly be one of them. This growing bitterness would eventually lead him down a dark path, to commit an act so treacherous, so unforgivable, that it would shatter the peace of Asgard forever and set in motion the first terrible steps toward Ragnarok. He was the god of cleverness and lies, but even his silver tongue could not change the one truth that governed all beings, from gods to men, the finality of death. And in the Norse world, what happened after you died was a matter of great and often grim importance. The old skald in the longhouse falls silent for a moment, his eyes on the dancing flames. He has told you of the gods and their complex world, but now he addresses the one truth that governs all beings, from Odin on his high throne to the humblest thrall, the finality of death. To be a Norseman, he says, his voice low and serious, is to know that your fate, your weird, is already woven. You cannot escape the day you are meant to die. But what comes after? That is a matter of great importance, for not all halls of the dead are created equal. For the Viking, death was not an end. It was merely a doorway to another hall, another feast, or another eternity of cold gloom. The Christian concept of a heaven for the good and a hell for the wicked was foreign to them. Their afterlife was not a judgment on one's moral character, but a direct consequence of the manner of one's death. And above all other fates, one was desired: a warrior's death. If you were a warrior and died heroically in the heat of battle, your soul would be met on the battlefield by the Valkyries. These were Odin's warrior maidens, the choosers of the slain, who rode across the skies on magnificent steeds. They would select the bravest of the dead to be brought to Asgard, to the most famous hall in all the 9 realms, Valhalla. Valhalla was Odin's great hall, a paradise for the chosen warriors, the Einherjar. It was a place of impossible martial grandeur. Its roof was made not of thatch, but of overlapping golden shields. Its rafters were not wooden beams, but great polished spears. Inside, long benches were set for an eternal feast. The skald describes the daily life of these chosen dead, and it is a warrior's dream. Every morning, the Einherjar wake, put on their armor, and march out to the great fields of Asgard to do what they do best: fight. They would battle each other all day long in a glorious bloody free-for-all, inflicting terrible wounds and dying all over again. But in the evening, as the sun set, all their injuries would be miraculously healed. They would rise, whole again, and return to the great hall to feast. Their nightly feast was as magnificent as their daily battle. They would dine on the meat of the great cosmic boar, Sehrimir, who was large enough to feed the entire host. Every evening he was cooked and eaten, and every morning he was magically resurrected, ready to be cooked again. They would wash down the boar with endless horns of the finest mead, which flowed like a river from the udders of the goat, Heidrun, who lived on the roof of Valhalla, constantly nibbling the leaves of the great tree Yggdrasil. This was their eternity, a cycle of glorious battle followed by joyous feasting, day after day. But this was not an endless party for its own sake. Valhalla was Odin's great training camp. The Allfather was assembling the greatest army of heroes the world had ever known for one single purpose: to fight alongside him at Ragnarok, the final, doomed battle at the end of the world. However, Valhalla was not the only glorious destination. The goddess Freya, a powerful war deity in her own right, also claimed her share of the slain. She had the right to the first choice of half of all warriors who died in battle. They were brought to her own magnificent hall, Sessrumnir, located in her realm of Folkvanger, the field of the people. While the sagas speak less of what happened in Freya's hall, it was considered an equally honorable fate to be chosen by her. This division of the afterlife had a profound impact on the Viking mindset. It glorified a warrior's death above all else. To die in battle was not a tragedy, it was a triumph, a ticket to an eternity of feasting and fighting with the gods. But what of everyone else? What of the men who died of sickness, the women who died in childbirth, the children, the old? Their fate was far less glorious. They were destined for hell. This was not a place of fire and eternal punishment like the Christian hell. It was a cold, damp, and gloomy underworld, ruled by Loki's daughter of the same name. Her appearance was terrifying. One half of her body was that of a beautiful woman, while the other half was that of a rotting corpse. Her realm was a place of shadows, mist, and eternal boredom. To die a straw death. A peaceful death in a bed from sickness or old age was seen as inglorious. It meant an eternity of listless wandering in a gray, uneventful underworld, forgotten by the gods and men alike. This belief system created a culture that embraced risk, valued courage above all else, and saw a heroic death as the ultimate achievement. But the warriors in Valhalla were not training for sport. They were preparing for a war against an ancient and powerful enemy, a race of beings born from the same primordial chaos as the gods themselves. They were training to fight the giants. The Skald has told you of the gods who ruled the heavens and the monsters who lurked in the shadows. But his audience, the men and women in the Longhouse, did not just listen to tales of the divine. They listened for lessons. They listened for examples of how a mortal man or woman should live and die in this brutal world. And for that, they had the great sagas of their own human heroes. These sagas were more than just stories. They were the history, the literature, and the moral compass of the Norse people. Epic prose narratives, passed down orally for generations before being written down in Iceland centuries later. They chronicled the lives of legendary and historical figures. They were a mirror in which the Viking saw his own values reflected: courage, loyalty, cunning, and above all, the pursuit of a reputation that would outlive death. To have a saga sung about you in the Longhouse, to have your name remembered long after your body had turned to dust, that was the only true immortality a mortal could achieve. One of the greatest of these heroes was Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, a figure whose tale is told in the epic Völsunga Saga. Sigurd was a hero of almost divine lineage, a descendant of Odin himself, and he was destined for greatness. His most famous deed was the slaying of the great dragon, Fafnir. Fafnir was once a dwarf who, consumed by greed, murdered his own father for a cursed hoard of gold, and transformed into a monstrous dragon to guard it. Sigurd, guided by his cunning foster father, did not face the dragon in open combat. Instead, he dug a pit on the path the dragon took to drink water. As the great beast slithered over the pit, Sigurd thrust his magical sword, Gram, up from below, piercing the dragon's soft underbelly and killing him As the dragon lay dying, its venomous black blood poured into the pit. On the advice of a magical guide, Sigurd bathed in the dragon's blood, and it made his skin invulnerable, impervious to any weapon, all but for one small spot on his back, where a linden leaf had fallen and stuck to his skin. He then roasted and ate the dragon's heart, and in doing so was granted the ability to understand the language of birds, who warned him of his foster father's treachery. Though his tale ultimately ends in betrayal and tragedy, brought about by the cursed gold he claimed, Sigurd's story is the ultimate heroic model, a man of great lineage, courage, and cunning, who defeats a monstrous symbol of chaos and greed. But not all heroes were dragon slayers. Others were famous for the manner of their death, which was seen as the final and most important test of a man's character. Perhaps the most legendary of these was Ragnar Lothbrok, or Hairy Breeches. Ragnar was a semi-mythical Viking king and raider whose life was a whirlwind of battles and exploration. His true legend, however, was forged in his final moments. According to the saga, Ragnar was finally captured by his enemy, King Ella of Northumbria. Determined to make an example of the famous Viking, Ella ordered him thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. As he lay dying, bitten and poisoned, Ragnar did not scream, nor did he beg for mercy. Instead, he is said to have laughed. He faced his agonizing death with defiant joy, using his final breaths to taunt his enemies and proclaim his legacy. His final words became famous throughout the Norse world. "How the little pigs would grunt," he declared, referring to his many sons, "if they knew how the old boar suffers." He boasted that his death would be avenged, and that he looked forward to the Valkyries carrying him to the great feast that awaited him in Odin's Hall of Valhalla. These sagas were the moral and cultural instruction manual for the Viking Age. In a society that was often violent and lawless, a man's reputation, his domr, was his most valuable asset. The sagas taught a young Norseman what was valued: to be brave in the face of impossible odds, to be fiercely loyal to your chieftain and family, to be generous with your wealth, and to face your predetermined death without a flicker of fear. A good death, and a story that would be told about it for generations around the hearthfire, was the ultimate ambition. The lives of these heroes were the bridge between the world of men and the world of the gods, a demonstration of how to live a life worthy of a place in Valhalla. The old skald gestures to the carved wooden pillars of the longhouse, where angular, mysterious symbols are etched into the dark wood. The lives of gods and heroes were not just shaped by the sword and the axe, he says. They were guided and twisted by older, deeper forces. The power of the spoken word, the secret of the carved stone, and the strange, often feared magic that could unravel the very threads of fate. In the Norse world, magic was very real. But it was not a simple matter of incantations and fireballs. It was a complex and often dangerous art, divided into different traditions. The most common and respected form of magic, often practiced by men, was the mastery of the runes. The runes were far more than just an alphabet for writing. You will remember that Odin himself paid a terrible price to discover their secrets, hanging for 9 days and nights from the world tree, pierced by his own spear, a sacrifice of himself to himself. The knowledge he gained was not just of letters, but of deep cosmic power. Each of the 24 symbols of the Elder Futhark, the oldest runic alphabet, had a name, a phonetic sound, and a powerful sentence, inherent magical concept. The rune Fehu was not just the F sound. It represented wealth, cattle, and prosperity. The rune Uruz was not just you. It was the raw, untamable strength of the wild ox. Thurisaz was the destructive power of the giants, a symbol of conflict. A man who understood these meanings, a rune master, could carve them onto objects to imbue them with power. Runes were carved into the blades of swords to grant them victory, onto the prows of longships for safe passage, onto drinking horns to protect against poison, and onto small pieces of wood or stone to be used as talismans for luck or protection. But the true power came from Galdr, the magical act of chanting or singing the names and sounds of the runes in powerful incantations. This was a scholarly, almost scientific magic, a matter of learning the symbols and their meanings and using them to influence the world. But there was another kind of magic, a wilder, more primal, and far more dangerous art. This was cider, a powerful form of shamanic magic that dealt directly with the spirits and the weaving of fate. While rune magic was about commanding and shaping, cider was about seeing, communing, and influencing the future on a deeper level. Cider was almost exclusively the domain of women. A practitioner, known as a vulva or seithkona, was a seeress, a witch, a figure of immense power and respect. The sagas describe the ritual of cider in detail. The vulva would sit upon a high platform, a seithhjallar, and, with the help of ritual songs chanted by other women, she would enter a deep trance. In this state, she could commune with the spirits of the dead, see events happening across the 9 realms, or look into the future to prophesize the fate of a person or a kingdom. She could also weave spells to help her allies or, more terrifyingly, to curse her enemies, bringing them bad luck, sickness, or even death. This form of magic was considered so powerful and so inherently female that for a man to practice it was a source of great shame. The act of receiving spirits into one's body was seen as passive and sexually receptive, a profound taboo for a Viking warrior. This concept was known as ergi, a term for effeminacy that was one of the worst insults you could level at a Norseman. And yet, Odin, in his insatiable quest for every form of knowledge and power, humbled himself to learn the art of cider from the goddess Freya, who was its greatest master. It was an act for which the trickster Loki would never let him forget, often mocking him in the halls of Asgard for practicing women's magic. The fact that the All-Father himself was willing to risk such shame speaks to the incredible power the Norse attributed to cider. The vulva was a figure who existed outside the normal social structures. She was often an itinerant wanderer, traveling from town to town, her arrival an event of great significance. Chieftains and kings would summon her, offering her great honor and lavish gifts in exchange for her prophecies. She would predict the success of a harvest, the outcome of a battle, or the destiny of a newborn child. Her words were not taken lightly. They were seen as a glimpse into the unchangeable tapestry of fate itself. And so, the 9 realms were alive with magic. The scholarly, commanding power of the runes, and the wild, prophetic, and often feared spirit of cider. Odin, the master of both, could see the threads of fate more clearly than any other being. He saw the great triumphs to come, the secrets of the cosmos, and the impending doom of the gods. But there was one event, one single act of malice born from the clever mind of Loki, that all his magic and all his foresight could not prevent. An act that would plant the first true seed of Ragnarok. The joy has fled Asgard. The death of Balder, a murder born of Loki's treachery, was a wound from which the gods would never recover. It was the first note in the funeral dirge of the world, the act that broke the bonds of kinship and set the final terrible prophecies in motion. The path to Ragnarok was now set. Beskald tells you that the first sign of the end would be a breakdown of the world of men. All bonds of family and honor would fail. Brother would fight brother. Fathers would kill sons, and the world would be plunged into an age of violence, an axe age, a sword age, where morality itself would cease to exist. This would be followed by the Fimbulver, the mighty winter. 3 consecutive, relentless winters would grip the 9 realms, with no summers in between. The sun would grow weak, and the world would be buried in snow and ice, a time of desperate, unending cold and darkness, where nearly all of humanity would perish. Then, the very foundations of the cosmos would begin to shake. From his lonely island, the great wolf Fenrir would finally shatter the magical ribbon Gleipnir, his howls of rage echoing through the worlds. The chains binding Loki would break, freeing the trickster god, his heart now consumed by pure black hatred for the Aesir. And from the depths of the ocean, the colossal Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, would rise in a fury, his massive body thrashing and causing catastrophic floods to sweep over the lands of men. The enemies of the gods would begin to gather. From the east, a great ship named Naglfar would set sail. It was a ship made entirely from the uncut fingernails and toenails of the human dead, a truly grotesque vessel, and its crew was an army of frost giants. From the south, the fiery realm of Muspelheim would split open, and a great fire giant Surtur, his sword burning brighter than the sun, would lead his sons of fire across the Bifrost Bridge, which would shatter under their weight. Loki, now free, would sail from the north, piloting a ship carrying the grim armies of Hel, the dishonorable dead. In Asgard, the god Heimdall, the ever-vigilant guardian, would see this host of enemies approaching. He would raise his great horn, Galahorn, and sound a single, piercing blast that would be heard throughout all the 9 realms. It was the final alarm. The war had come. Hearing the call, Odin would lead his army from Valhalla. The great hall, with its 540 doors, would pour forth the Einherjar, the host of dead heroes he had been assembling for eons. They would march to the great plain of Vigrid, the battlefield where the final conflict was destined to take place. Unlike many other mythologies, the Norse cosmos was not eternal. The gods were not immortal. They knew they were doomed to die in this final battle. This fatalism is a core element of the Viking warrior ethos. The goal was not to win Ragnarok. Victory against the forces of chaos was prophesied to be impossible, but to face your predetermined doom with courage, to fight bravely alongside your gods, and to die a death worthy of a saga. It was a worldview that found meaning not in ultimate victory, but in the nobility of the struggle itself. And so, the final duels began. Odin, the All-Father, clad in his golden helmet, would charge directly at his most feared nemesis, the wolf Fenrir. The battle would be fierce, but the prophecy was true. Fenrir's mighty jaws would open so wide they stretched from the earth to the sky, and he would swallow the king of the gods whole. Thor, the champion of Midgard, would face his own great rival, the Midgard serpent Jörmungandr. The thunder god would fight with a terrible fury, the sky filled with lightning and the sea with tidal waves. He would finally succeed in killing the great serpent, smashing its head with his hammer, Mjolnir. But as the monster died, it would spew its venom all over Thor. The god would stagger back 9 paces, and then he too would fall, dead from the poison. Vanir god Freyr, the lord of the harvest, would fight against the fire giant Surtur. But Freyr had long ago given away his magical, self-fighting sword to win the love of a giantess, and so he would fight with an antler. He would be one of the first to fall before Surtur's mighty flaming sword. The one-handed god Tyr, who had sacrificed his hand to bind Fenrir, would face Garmr, the guard dog of the gates of hell. They would be evenly matched, and in their ferocious battle, they would kill each other, and the 2 great rivals, the forces of order and chaos, would finally meet. Heimdall, the guardian of the Bifrost Bridge, and Loki, the trickster, would fight their last battle. They too would slay one another, their ancient enmity ending in mutual destruction. The great battle is over. The gods are dead. The giants are dead. The 9 worlds are in their death throes. The skald's voice drops to a whisper. He tells you that the fire giant Surtur will then fling his fire across the entire earth. The great world tree, Yggdrasil, will shudder and burn. The sun will turn black. The stars will vanish from the sky, and the earth itself, scorched and dying, will sink completely beneath the boiling sea. All is silence. All is darkness. This is the end, or is it? The skald has told the stories of heroes who lived by the sword and died for glory. But now, his voice becomes hushed as he speaks of the other, unseen forces that shaped the destinies of both gods and men. The old skald's tale is at its end, and he speaks of the final prophecy, the one that comes after the end. For a long age, there is only silence and water. But the end was not truly the end. The Norse worldview was not linear, but cyclical. After the destruction, there must come a new creation, a new spring. Slowly, gently, a new earth begins to rise from the waves. It is not the old, scarred Midgard, a world defined by its battles and its borders. This new world is beautiful, green, and wonderfully fertile. Waterfalls cascade down mountainsides that were once barren rock, and the fields yield bountiful crops without any need for sowing. Before the wolf skull devoured the sun, she had given birth to a daughter, a new son, who now takes her mother's place in the sky. Her light is gentler, her warmth more life-giving than the old one had been, and from the ruins of the old world, a few survivors emerge. A handful of the younger generation of gods return. From the grim realm of hell, which was untouched by Surtur's fire, two figures walk back into the light. It is Baldur, the beautiful god whose death had set Ragnarok in motion, now returned, his innocence tempered with the wisdom of the underworld. And with him is his blind brother, Hother, who had been his unwitting killer. In this new world, their past conflict is forgiven and forgotten. They are simply brothers again. Two of Thor's sons, Modi, whose name means courage, and Magni, strength, also survive. They make their way across the green fields and find their father's greatest treasure lying in the grass, unharmed, the mighty hammer Mjolnir. They will now wield it in his stead, not as a weapon of war, but as a tool to hallow and protect this new, peaceful world. Two of Odin's sons also endure, the silent god Vidar, who had avenged his father by killing the wolf Fenrir, and his brother Vali. These surviving gods travel to the field of Idavellir, the glittering plain where the halls of Asgard once stood. And there, sitting in the green grass, they find the taffel, the golden game pieces that the original Aesir had played with at the dawn of time. They sit together and they talk. They speak of the great events of the past. They remember their history. They remember Loki's treachery. They remember the Midgard serpent. And they remember the wisdom and the sacrifices of their father Odin. But the world needs more than just a few quiet gods. It needs humanity. Before the end, two humans had found refuge from Surtur's fire by hiding deep within the trunk of the world tree, Yggdrasil, which, though burned, had not been completely destroyed. The man's name was Leif, which means life, and the woman's was Leifthrossir, the striver after life. They survived by drinking the morning dew. Now they emerge from the tree into the new green world. They are the new Ask and Embla, the ancestors of a new race of humanity that will repopulate the earth. This idea of a world born from destruction and the survival of a few to begin a new cycle is a powerful and hopeful theme. It suggests a worldview where nothing truly ends. For the Vikings, even the ultimate apocalypse, Ragnarok, was not a final judgment, but a necessary cleansing. It was a way of understanding the cycles of nature, of winter giving way to spring, of death leading to new life. It offered a sliver of hope in a mythology that was otherwise deeply fatalistic. Even after the greatest imaginable disaster, life, in some form, would find a way to continue. And so, the new world began, born from the ashes of the old. A world of peace and innocence, without the constant, grinding struggle between the gods and the giants. But the memory of the old world, of its flawed, brave, and ultimately doomed gods, would be what shaped the new one. Their stories, the very ones the Skald is telling you now, would become the foundation of this new age of peace. The old Skald finishes his tale. The fire in the center of the longhouse has burned down to a deep, glowing bed of embers. Outside, the winter wind still howls, but inside, a profound silence has fallen over the hall. The epic story of a universe born from ice and fire, of flawed gods and cunning giants, of heroic deeds and a doomed final battle is complete. But what does it all mean? What does this dark and fatalistic mythology tell us about the people who gathered in halls like this one to hear it? To understand the Viking mindset, one must first understand their concept of fate, or word. For the Norsemen, the universe was not a place of free will and endless possibilities. It was governed by a destiny that was preordained, woven by the three great Norns at the base of the world tree, the threads of every life. From the lowliest thrall to the All-Father, Odin himself, were spun, measured, and cut by these powerful female beings. No one, not even the gods, could escape their fate. His belief in an unchangeable destiny is the key to their entire worldview. Odin, the wisest of all beings, knew from prophecy that he was doomed to be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir at Ragnarok. Thor knew he was destined to die from the Midgard serpent's venom. Yet, they did not spend their lives trying to flee this fate. Instead, they spent their lives preparing to meet it with courage. If your end is already written, then the only thing that truly matters is how you live your life, and most importantly, how you face that end. This is the heart of the Viking Code of Honor. It was a philosophy that valued action over words, strength over weakness, and loyalty to one's kin and chieftain above all else. The goal was to build a reputation, a Dahmer, that would outlive your physical death. The sagas are filled with heroes who, facing impossible odds, choose to fight and die rather than retreat in shame. A good death, a heroic death in battle, was the highest honor a man could achieve, because it was the one part of his destiny he had some control over. The Norse gods were not benevolent, perfect beings to be worshipped for salvation. They were powerful, flawed figures to be emulated. They lied, they schemed, they had terrible tempers, they broke oaths, and they made disastrous mistakes. They were, in many ways, superpowered immortal humans. A Viking did not pray to Odin to solve his problems. He looked to Odin's story as an example of the relentless, often painful pursuit of wisdom. He did not ask Thor for forgiveness. He looked to Thor's example of facing the overwhelming forces of chaos with simple, unflinching courage. The gods provided a model for how to live and die honorably in a harsh and often unforgiving world. Ultimately, the great struggle of Norse mythology is not one of good versus evil. It is a struggle of order versus chaos. The gods, for all their flaws, represent order. They build worlds, they create laws, they forge societies, and they protect humanity. The giants, on the other hand, represent the untamable, destructive forces of the natural world. The crushing ice, the raging storms, the brutal, unthinking wilderness. The great tragedy and the most profound lesson of these myths is that in the end, chaos is destined to win. The gods are doomed to fall. The sun will be extinguished and the world will sink beneath the waves. But the ultimate glory lies not in winning this impossible battle. It lies in fighting it with all your strength until the very end. It is a worldview that is at once grimly fatalistic and fiercely heroic. A mythology that tells us that even if the end is certain, the manner in which we face it is everything. And even in the face of total annihilation, there is the promise of a new world, a new beginning, a cycle of life that continues forever. A worldview that is at once grimly fatalistic and fiercely heroic. A mythology that teaches us that even if the end is certain, the manner in which we face it is everything. Thank you for joining us in the Longhouse for this journey into Norse mythology. These weren't just fantastic tales of gods and monsters. They were the spiritual and psychological bedrock of the Viking Age, a way for a people in a harsh, unforgiving world to make sense of life, death, and the chaotic forces of nature. If you enjoy these deep dives into the minds of the past, please consider supporting the channel. Leaving a like on the video helps these stories reach more people, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss our next journey. And now I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below, which of the Norse gods do you find more compelling? The wise, scheming, and self-sacrificing Odin, or the strong, direct, and protective Thor? Thank you again for listening. Until our next journey to the past, sleep well.